Emilio, how are you doing, Emilio?
Fine, fine. How are you, Daniel?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. Grace turned 5 on the 6th, and she made me this duck. Do you see the duck, Emilio? It definitely looks like a duck, doesn't it? I mean, you see, let me turn it so it's not the mirror effect. So I have a Pac-Man duck now that Grace made me this morning in celebration of her birthday. So she's a very giving soul where she's giving on her birthday to other people. So now I'm extremely interested in Chetan. Great to see you. Like based on our conversation last week, I'm curious what you think about this. So we were talking last week. We've talked a lot about kind of ideas of how people develop. Can people move into intrinsic motivation? Can people move from and people to dash people? Can people move to identifying more with paradox? And Tom had that great idea of moving the implicit into the explicit, knowing when to hold, when to drop, and these kind of movements. We've talked about the possibility of intrinsic motivation, as long as by that we don't mean impulsiveness, right? We've talked about this kind of process of seeing the good. And Tyler, great to see you. Chetan, always a pleasure. And so there's been this idea with that of some sort of transformation that can help people escape capture, right? Delusion capture. We talked about the Kafka stories. We talked about Black Mirror and this kind of development that people can engage in order to escape those different things. Andrew, great to see you, my friend. Great to see you. So there's this kind of idea that a kind of change. And we've talked about Nietzsche and Overman. We've talked about absolute knowers. But all of this kind of begs the question, can people change? What is the nature of that change? Can people develop? Because if we're going to talk about the question of, say, scaling, that was something that came up last week on sort of scaling the ability to know how to be a shark who doesn't define rest as being still. We've defined like the questions of intrinsic motivation. So this question of scaling, which then, of course, Javier was mentioning in a video that whenever you scale something, it's kind of risky. Religion, once you scale it, can become an institution that is problematic. Once you scale, say, capitalism, it turns into corporatism. So there's always this problem of scale. But then there's also this kind of question of, how do you change people? How do you teach people? Can people be taught? This is a question I'm extremely interested in. Because the nature of human transformation and human development seems paramount for a lot of what we are discussing, and even if it can occur. So I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on that. That's something I kind of, after our last week's conversation, entered crazy land thinking about all this. Now, it may surprise you to know that there are times when I'm not in crazy land, but I've been thinking about this kind of question of the nature of human development, and if development may not even be the right word. That's like, what do we mean when we talk about, say, moving into an overman or an absolute Noah? Is that a kind of development? Maybe a better word is learning. These are things I think about. I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on that. And thank you all for being here today. It's great to see you.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question, and I think it's kind of that's kind of like in some ways the question, right? To like in relation to all these topics, and I think it's well, as with anything, like for to answer that question, you have to to answer like other like the nature of, I would say, like, well, not reality per se, like metaphysics per se, like ontology, because you could say like the first thing I thought is like determinism versus free will, because if you're determined, like in a sense, like you cannot change, or you can only change in the way that you were always gonna change. But that's like hard, like philosophical determinism, but in a more like practical sense, um there seems to be, at least I think, okay, there seems to be that at the very least you have to have certain conditions for change to happen. Like for example, I have to have like a healthy functioning brain for me to learn stuff, right? So there's like at least a physical component that goes into it, right? So it's because if like I don't know, like I get hit in my head and half of my neurons don't fire up, like I cannot learn, right? So there's as with anything, there's like I think like a strong physical component to it. And when you go into the physical component, that's when I think it gets like trickier, because it's very deterministic in the sense, or not deterministic, very binary, in the sense that if you have a healthy brain, you can learn. If your brain, like, you get hit in the head with something, you cannot, right? So there's like a really hard breaking point between like being able to and not being able to, like the physical component. But then you get into like the most like ephemeral or like yeah, the difficult things like psychology and stuff, and that's where it may get interesting. And one thing I could share very anecdotically, like there's I don't know if there's any like papers like talking about this, but here here in Mexico there's a lot of like depending on the region you go to, there's the cultural difference are very big. And like for example, I live in Cuernavaca, that's town. I go to school, so I go with people that are also going to university. So you can say that there's the type of worldview is kind of the same, right? So you can aspire to develop in a way that makes sense for both, right? Because if you go to university, maybe you want to have a job, probably you want to have a business so you can like sustain yourself. So your goals in a sense are aligned, so you can have a development that functions like the with like you can scale that to like at least the people in the university because it makes sense, right? But my mom was invited to be the godmother of someone that lives in a small, like a really small town, a pueblo we would call here in Mexico, a pueblito, and their whole view is really different. There are people that live day to day. They have enough money to sustain themselves. Like they don't have any savings. Like they live day to day, and the way they view the world is rather different than us. So the way they develop the way they would experience development would be so very different, right? So that you could say that, oh, you and it's different because you could say that these the people that live in this small town, like normally they don't finish like formal education or anything, but and some people say like, oh, that's bad. And like it depends if you use the framework of like university and a job, right? That's a yeah, that's not a great idea. But when you talk with them and you see and understand their worldview, it's just radically different. And then and then it becomes really strange, right? Because the two like concrete things, I would say that it depends in a sense of your worldview, the way that you can be developed. Because if someone, for example, doesn't want a job or doesn't want to be imperceptible or something, like you cannot develop towards that because it's not something they they really get or can get because of their personal circumstances. The same way that I've talked about the tribe that view their body as like a walking tree. Like you cannot tell them to be perceptible. That concept like doesn't even really understand to them that because their whole world is different. I would say that you can only develop people that have like like the development only works with people that have the same kind of worldview. And I think that I experienced that the it has to be not necessarily, but it seems to be at least statistically speaking that the younger the development happens in a person's lifetime, the better the development. Because I've talked with uncles and stuff, and the transformation is more difficult because you have all these ingrained like like psychological traits of thought, right? So it's at least more difficult. I would say that as you progress in age, it's harder to develop. Not all people are there are some people that I know that are that have a lot of years and they still develop, and it's marvelous. And not all people, but it seems that at least a significant percentage. And the worldviews, those would be the two things I can think right now that would affect the development to the becoming of a person. So yeah.
Well, thank you, Emilio, and I'll pass it on to Mr. Luber here. So there's something about condition. You have to have a functioning brain, for example, you pointed out. Then there's neuroplasticity. Then there's the environment. So those are some interesting considerations. So Andrew, good to see you today. So I hope you're doing well.
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. I'm glad the family's doing good. Yeah, I think that the question of change is a good question. When I hear that question, to me, I think of the question of meaning. And I feel like for you to dive into the question of change, you'll hit a more primordial focal point in life, which is meaning, in my opinion, where basically meaning is the gestalt of action. And that the question of change directly relates to the question I've been wrestling with, which is what values need to alter in order for change to occur. So there's a lot, in my opinion, to unpack from that sentence. What is a value? How does a value relate to a change? I think there's a dynamic relationship there. And that relationship reflects, just because I've been obsessed with this lately, it just reflects the phenomenology of the artist in so many ways. That change has to do with how one interprets the no-thingness within the situation. So just to elaborate on like a point I like to make, you go into a movie theater, you sit down, you watch the movie, there's a mutual being in the room, this understanding being, and that could be interpreted as the no-thingness in the situation. It's the that's to me the gestalt point of change. So it's realizing essentially that you are getting a mere understanding of the phenomena, and since it's just a mere understanding, it opens you up to the possibility of other understanding. The phenomena, that is. So like that's why, like, when you go into a movie theater when you're age 12, you watch a movie, you interpret it as X. You go in when you're 35, after having, kids, you're going to see it as Y. It's going to be completely different, but yet the phenomena is still the same in terms of the substance of it.
Yeah, this question is fast. So, like, for example, if you I once heard someone say that you should read a great book every 10 years, and it's like a different book. And I've certainly had that experience with like Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, some different things that you revisit. Like, my gosh, the greatest example for me is every 5 years I reread The Sound of the Fury by William Faulkner, and it's become one of my favorite books. The first time I read it, I completely hated it. I was like, this is crap. And then now it's like a masterpiece, and I really like it. And there's something about the transformation of conditioning that one has gone through and the conditions they've gone through that transforms how you experience The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner is the particular book. It's a literary Southern fiction that I think is a masterpiece, but I did not think that when I first started. What to me is very interesting is that transformation we're talking about, where, say, the same phenomenon changes in what it means to you, and maybe it changes because you have a new meaning in life, so you approach it differently. There can be a feedback loop there. Is that an accident? This is what is interesting. Is that an accidental change in you or an essential change, if I use an Aristotelian language? Like, is that a change in your very mental hardware, or does everyone have a similar mental hardware, and it's simply if they go through the certain experiences they can have a similar change? The reason I ask it that way is because I was just listening. So after last week's talk, I went down a rabbit hole of I never liked anything involving like personality tests or personality development or anything like that, but I forced myself to go back into spiral dynamics and forced myself to go. And also Layman Pascal is going to be teaching at the Voice Craft starting October 10th, that class that I'm really looking forward to. It's going to be beautiful. And Tyler is part of just a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful organization. And Layman Pascal will work under integral theory. And this is this kind of idea of an advancing personality or development of consciousness that learns how to, say, deal with paradox, deal with tension, deal with differences. And in spiral dynamics, there can be this kind of idea that there's a developing personality or consciousness that comes to, they'll talk about tier 2, they'll talk about yellow, they'll talk about turquoise, these kind of different abilities that people have where, say, they can handle they don't fall into the temptation for a totalizing system, right? That like a yellow person or a turquoise is able to appreciate difference. And there's this idea that there's this development. I then saw that this actually came up on the intellectual dark web, which was quite lovely, that they were talking about this. And, you know, there's that book, The Dawn of Humanity, that came out that wants to argue that ancient people were not actually unsophisticated. They were very intelligent. But then at the same time, though I am not sure about, I guess, an integral, I can't remember if it's spiral dynamics. I'd be curious if anyone knows why Ken Wilber made integral theory apart from spiral dynamics and changed the colors. It feels like it was really confusing, and I'm not sure why that occurred. If anyone knows, please inform me. I am a novice. I don't know. But they'll talk about tier 3, which is kind of like clear light, cosmic consciousness, all that different stuff. I don't know about that stuff. But when they talk about, say, yellow and turquoise, I understand that this is research-based, right? That this is something that they have observed, that different people have different ways of apprehending the world and understanding things. Well, it's hard for me not to assert. So regardless, I don't want to say, you see, I have trouble with the idea of a kind of development. Like there are personalities that have kind of developed higher than other people, right? There's something about that that seems problematic. But there is possibility that, say, people who have had certain experiences, like, I wonder if spiral dynamics is actually a reflection of cultural adaptation versus, say, psychological development. I would bet you in the same way that you locate a lot of conservatives in America in rural areas and liberals in cities, I bet you that colors of spiral dynamics cluster around similar material conditions. That's my theory. I have no proof. I would not be surprised if a lot of, say, greens or yellows are found in college areas, that blues are found in other areas. I wonder if spiral dynamics, rather than, say, some sort of evolving personality, and I think we forget that evolving does not mean necessarily advancement. It can mean, and they mentioned this actually on IDW, like I was thinking about that, like it could just mean like what adaptation is best for survival. And if you live in a college town surrounded by a lot of different people, it's not a very good survival strategy to be, say, a fundamentalist. You're going to be excommunicated. So you learn to culturally adapt to that condition so that one can survive, right? You know, in different things. The reason I'm very interested in this, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak. I almost want to talk about cone dynamics versus spiral dynamics, which cone dynamics is sort of like a response to material conditions that are limited. And then like a college campus is a limited material condition that then can maybe gradually spread, and the color then grows as the rarer material condition emerges. And it's not necessarily like climbing up, which sounds advancement, but a sort of spreading of a certain cultural adaptation that has changes in how people personally react as a adaptive strategy so that they survive. And the reason this is important, I think, is because if you believe that, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak, if you believe that consciousness or personality, I get confused, frankly, on a lot of the spiral dynamics and integral theory. When they say personal development, then they'll sometimes say psychological development and consciousness development. I'm not sure what the correct term is, and someone can please inform me what would be the best way to language this. If we think that consciousness can, say, progress or evolve or have some sort of material difference, then the creation of absolute communities, Overman, all the stuff we've been talking about in all these net conversations, is very different than if you think it's a result. If you think it's something like an evolving consciousness, then the strategy you employ will be something like teaching people the right ideas, getting them the right information to evolve their personality. Well, if you think instead it's an adaptation to a certain material condition, then the question becomes, like in cone dynamics, as I'm just tentatively calling it, then the name of the game becomes not scaling, but spreading those material conditions to more and more people so that they will be in the material situation that they would then adapt to enter into, say, a state of absolute knowing or overmen, or if we want to use yellow, turquoise, tier 2, Deleuzian individuals. So it seems to me that if you have a spiral dynamic metaphor, you can talk about scaling and planning. Whereas if you talk about a cone dynamic, it seems to have a lot more about spreading and clearing, more so actually, like clearing things aside so that there's space for emergence. But this is something I think, like the difference between spiral dynamics or cone dynamics, seems to me to be very relevant for this question of the spreading of intrinsic motivation, the spreading of the capacity to avoid delusion capture, the spreading of all the different things we've been talking about in these net questions that we kind of left hanging last time. It seems like that is an important thing to address.
I completely agree with the assessment that you make, that the material environment like brings forward a type of like development that for me it seems but for me that's like one of the most obvious things, but when things are too obvious we have to be careful because that's not good, right? But for example, what I was thinking is that if you live in a place that the ceiling is like 1 meter above the ground, you cannot learn to jump, right? So it's only when you have a taller suit that you can learn to jump. So in the sense that if you're in a college and you have this, let's say this, a framework for you to express yourself in a more green way, let's say, right? So, but if you're in another environment that if you're green, they will eat you up, then you like, you, of course, you cannot do that. So you adapt. And I don't know how to describe it, materialist in that sense, that I really think that from the material conditions like rise almost everything we experience, right? Because let's on a personal like reflection, and this like actually really changed the way I understand the world, is that I attended school, so that was like physical, right? Like then the COVID hit, it was virtual. I didn't like the classes, I stopped taking them, and so I just stayed at my house, like working stuff, writing, etc., taking courses. But I most days I didn't leave my house, right? I stayed in my house. And now I've returned to school, and now I actually like move myself through space and through like places. And like I think like most I don't know if that's a common experience, because you always have to do stuff, right? So if you're working, you have to go places, you have to, so like I in retrospect I could experience being in like a single place for a long time, and then I am actually like physically moving in places, and I can think the way I feel, I perceive the world is different, and it makes sense because for me, I've talked about this before. If I get repetitive, like just stop me. But like I view ourselves like as, I think we are an extension of our environment in a very literal sense. Like if you have a couch, like the couch calls you to like like rest on it, right? If you have I don't know, a bike, it like calls you to to pedal and be on it. So the like the physical spaces we inhabit are in a way the most conductive for this development to be, because like in the most basic sense, in the sense that if you don't feel like safe at your home, like you, right? So that will leave. Okay, this is a really interesting statistic that in theory I read this, that for example, like here in Mexico, like the public education, it has the fame, or well, the notion that it's not that great, right? So people say that if we fix education, that we would fix all the problems in the country, right? That's the idea they have. But one YouTuber that's prominent here in Mexico, well, he said that no, actually, there's been this study that when you are in a lack mindset, you don't retain the things they teach you, right? So if you're in school, but if from your school to your house, you are afraid that you're going to get assaulted, that you're going to get hit, right? Or if you're home and you're going to have like domestic violence, or you don't have enough food to eat, right? So they teach you 10 things and you only retain 3 of them. So in that sense, like it doesn't matter if you have the greatest education of all, because like if the person is a bucket, like all the information is leaking because you don't have the enough like foundations to actually do the thing. So of course the physical conditions affect them. So if we take as a premise that physical conditions of course affect the development of a person, then it becomes maybe go to an interesting question that it's like kind of the recursiveness of it, because let's say that for example, if you have like states, right, and you can change between these different states, so but once you go into a specific state, you cannot come out of it, at least with your own resources. And which I mean by this is that, for example, if you are a healthy individual and stuff, to hands, to legs and everything, you can go to another city, right? So that condition, you can go anywhere. So, and you could say that from here, from Cuernavaca, I can go to Monterrey. That's like a city in the north, and I can experience that city and change my psychology and my development and go there, right? So that's, I can do that. I can change that. But if suddenly something happens tomorrow and I lose a hand, right? So that state permanently reduces the amount of things I can do. So in that sense, that's in a physical body sense, but in a place, right? So in a place, in a physical place, let's say that you are free to walk at whatever hour you choose, right? There's no imposed limit. But then suddenly, by whichever reason, you cannot walk from 10 to 11 a.m. You cannot walk on the street, from like 7 to 8. So that is a physical condition that limits the possibility of changing conditions, right? So you're like forced, and the more if you can arrive to a place that if the specific physical conditions are such, it's going to be really difficult to get out of it, because there's not, like, you get stuck, right? There's no possibility of change of development. So it's almost, of course, in the individual matter, but it's almost as if we can pay attention to our physical spaces, we can, not by magic, but we can assure that some development will occur. But like, is there, how do you, because you have to go, just start from a certain point, right? You don't start in a vacuum, you start from the point. So I think like physical spaces is a good notion of taking into account, and then how the physical space limits and gets you stuck in a specific place, versus how you can use the specific things here and rearrange them in certain ways so you can go to another stage. I hope I explained myself
No,
at least.
absolutely. And then I'll pass it on to Andrew. Javier, good to see you. And Javier, we're talking kind of about the problem of scale, and I'm talking about the difference between maybe scale and spread. I'm calling it cone dynamics versus spiral dynamics, and all of these different things. And Emilio, to what you're saying, we live in a feedback loop with our environment, and relative to what we can do and develop is going to be in accordance to what is available to us. And I think, like Marx will talk about material historicism, different things like that. That seems very important. I think this is critical, and then I'll pass it on to Andrew, because I was listening to Daniel S. I can never say his name. He was on Rebel Wisdom, and he was talking, the meta crisis and kind of the idea that there are, in politics, climate change, all these different things, these certain catastrophes that are all happening at the same time. And the meta crisis is kind of the idea that if we were to change our thinking, because that's our way of thinking is the underlying principle that is arising to the climate change problem, all of these different things, that's a way to address it. Because otherwise there are these certain game theory dynamics in operation in those things that won't allow them to solve themselves. So you have to change the underlying thinking. Well, this is a big issue then, because if thinking is changed by material condition, and you can't change the material condition because of the game theory dynamics, then you can't solve the quote unquote meta crisis by changing people's thinking. So if cone dynamics is the case, we have an issue. Whereas if you believe in, say, spiral dynamics, then it becomes theoretically possible if we follow the distinction I've made. And I'm not trying to say there's no truth to spiral dynamics. It just depends on what we mean by it. If it's not possible, say, for people's cognition or development or the different things we've talked about to change without there being a corresponding change of the condition that they're in, solving the meta crisis is quite difficult. Yes, how one goes about it. So that's something I've been thinking about that I will say, and this gets into the problem, I guess, of can you scale a new way of thinking, or can you only spread it by changing material conditions and therefore spreading the way of thinking that would help address the quote unquote meta crisis? No, to me, it's a huge, like, chicken or egg question. Can you change thinking do you change thinking and then change materiality? Or do you change more materiality and that then incubates new ways of thinking? That has a big impact on the strategy that one employs to deal with the quote unquote meta crisis. And by meta crisis, I take that term to mean, and maybe I'm wrong by this, to be the collection of all of the different kind of global crises going on and the way of seeing those crises. I don't use that term right here just to mean the crisis of how we view the world, although I've seen it used that way. Maybe that's incorrect, but I kind of use it as a basket term and a hermeneutical term. So this to me is a huge issue, and it kind of feeds into a lot of these net discussions on the questions of avoiding capture, avoiding Kafka, avoiding Black Mirror, et cetera, so forth. So no, I think it's a fascinating question to me.
You just explained yourself very well. I understand what's at play right now. It's a very complex issue. I venture to say that it's not a choice between one or the other, that it's kind of you're fixing both. For you to think that it's one or the other, I would say you're already starting off at the wrong like positionality point of the situation. And that also leads to what Amelia was saying regarding how do you go from capture to uncapture. The tone in which, like, in the way in which you were going about it, it made me think almost autonomously. Do you consciously go from capture to uncapture? Am I understanding you correctly, Emilio? Is that what you're suggesting? Like the question?
Yeah, if you're captured like in a very like literal sense, like for example, you have the same recurring thoughts, how can you not have those thoughts, right? You would need to like get away, but for you to get away would mean that you're already like on capture, right? So that's good.
I just heard this term like 2 days ago, optimal grip. Like John Vervaeke, you're talking about how does you go from capture from an optimal grip standpoint, right? It's again the initial starting point in how we need to look at the problem, even if we call it a problem. The thing with ontological design, where if we get into a situation where like these information monsters, the material becomes, autonomous on its own, and its autonomy, let's say, bests our own autonomy. How do we think in a world like that? And to me, we have to start back from how like consciousness comes to be. So to get like a little Hegelian, it's we start with we're thrown into this sensation, and in this thrownness we arrive to thinking. It's something that we arrive at. So I think we have to kind of look at that arrival process. If we get into a situation where we're bested by the material information, if our information is not as good as the material information where it runs us, essentially. And to me, that approach of arriving at thinking has to do with the complete reframing of the orientation of world and what that means of world.
We're talking about capture and conditionality. A couple of thoughts came to my mind about when we think about conditionality and this notion of like escaping. I think throughout history, and I have a tendency, like I study a lot of religion, so what people have done in history is they use the conditions as the escape. It is both at the same time. The condition is the capture and the escape at the same time. For example, Pure Land Buddhism, right? There was a problem about how does lay people become enlightened, because at the time, Buddhism, you can only be enlightened if you become a monk. Like that was, and that's a problem, right? Because not everybody can become a monk because there's conditions that you have to meet. And also society would fall apart. So this goes into Daniel's whole problem of scale. And so when we talk about, okay, so the problem is, how do you, for the Buddhists, how do you escape nirvana? How do you escape samsara, right? So this whole ideology becomes fixated on the peasants, the working class, basically, and it comes up with the Amida Buddha, where basically you're just saved by faith, right? You're just saved by faith. You're saved by the simple chanting of the Amida Buddha, and it's for the lay people. So you can see here how it uses the conditions already. What would seem as a capture, right, is already the opening gate for your enlightenment. And then also, I think, was it Mahayana Buddhism does a very interesting move where, most people think of Buddhism as like, you're trying to escape samsara, right? But Mahayana Buddhism goes, actually, nirvana is samsara and samsara is nirvana. So the very condition of like you trying to escape is actually your freedom. So I mean, I don't know if that kind of like helps answer like some questions about like how do we escape and like how do we use conditions and so on. But I think, like, in my opinion, even if we're talking about physical conditions, like if you have no legs, you don't, like, in my opinion, you don't try to like make new legs. I mean, you can, but it's more like, how do you use that condition to make yourself uncaptured? How do you use that? How do you invert the condition that seems like a capturable thing? I think really the whole idea, and you kind of get this premise from heaven, and it's really kind of like the concept of like heaven and earth, really, where I think Nishitani says something very interesting, like actually heaven is always underfoot of earth. And you actually almost get this kind of idea in Nietzsche, where he's very proud about earth, but actually if you kind of, I mean, in my interpretation, actually earth is heaven for Nietzsche. So the real question is, how do you invert that looking at earth as heaven? How do you make that capture as uncapture without necessarily changing the condition?
It does make me think of the internet in the sense of you can use it. You can use the internet to encounter diversity and ideas and become, if we use the spiral dynamic language, yellow or turquoise, tier 2, or you could use it to be captured by the corporations. Same, because the internet would constitute a material condition, right? And this is an example. Like I would bet that exposure to the internet can contribute to, say, the moving into the cultural adaptation of tier 2 in spiral dynamics, like yellow and turquoise, not an evolving consciousness, but it just the exposure to the internet. Because that's kind of the distinction I was making, Javier, before you kind of arrived, where spiral dynamics will talk about the development of personality. And I wonder if instead it's more so a reflection of cultural adaptations to societal conditions, whether it be pluralism or the internet. And as those material conditions spread, then the colors, what they'll talk about, yellow and turquoise, and I might be, will that spread? And thinking about maybe instead of it in terms of some sort of evolution of consciousness, that is instead a cultural adaptation strategy. And that also, I bring that up and then I'll give it to Tyler very quickly. It makes me think of the Flynn effect, which is that idea that people's IQs have kind of risen. They've done the studies and shown that there's been a natural rise of IQ over, the centuries or different things. Well, that seems to speak of a kind of advancement of human intelligence, right? That over time, humans have gotten smarter. Well, actually, the Flynn effect could just be evidence that people are encountering technology that they then have to use abstract reasoning to use. So it may not be evidence that we're getting smarter. It may be that we have to use different abilities to adapt to our situation. And so it's not that there's some sort of structural neurological advancement, but it could just be a different cultural adaptation strategy. And I think Flynn himself. And then if you understand that technology is not so much a result of people getting smarter, but more time passing so we can screw up and get trial and error, then the fact that people adapt to technology is not necessarily evidence of an evolving consciousness, right? So the transformation then is a result of a cultural adaptation. And then what that would mean for me, and then I'll pass it on to Tyler, is that if we're talking about making more people intrinsically motivated, making more people escape capture, making people, absolute knowing, overman, all the things we've talked about in these net conversations. It means spreading the conditions to where people, spreading instead of scaling, spreading the conditions that people can adapt to enter into that way of thinking so they come out of capture. And that would be like communities like, we're doing here, or Voicecraft or Philosophy Portal, like the spreading of these kind of conditions that people can be part of would seem to be important. And then the internet would be a vital material condition. But that was a lot I said, and I'd have to expand on that. But let me give it to Tyler, because I know he had his hand up, and then Andrew and Chetan.
I love these discussions. You guys really exercise my my working memory, like trying to keep track of like 10,000 different things that are coming out. I can see some relatedness. So when I try to answer these really difficult questions, or when I play with them, I don't know if I find an answer necessarily. What I tend to do first is try to exclude, right? So this is something I picked up from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, but via Sherlock Holmes, right? When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however unlikely, must be. Yeah. So that idea is something like this question of education, right? Is it possible to develop, to come into a moreness of understanding, of capacity? I think there are some presumptions that we make in certain of our scientific endeavors, which we presume some evolutionary development. So if you're talking about change in intelligence, right, we can measure IQ in humans, but clearly you represent a far more intelligent thing that can do more in terms of capacity and understanding than a snail. Right. So if we grant that presumption, then we have to assume there must be some mechanism by which things evolve and change over time, right? And what they have to then do is they have to retain that capacity, right? That has to be passed on. So the passing on is a question of it's this tension between scale and replication, I think. Right. So and this is related to some of the fundamental underlying principles I think that you can't quite escape with regards to change and this tension between what can be and what should be. Because this is, I love Andrew bringing this point up, that there's a number of false dichotomies that we were exploring here. One of which was the either or of, is it me or the environment? Well, it's both, right? It's got to be both. If they have, right, so we know this just in terms of like a simple physical metaphor, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So the act of pressing on a thing always pushes back on me in the exact same force. So it's clear that any capacity to do work, right, any ability to move material substance in this world is necessitating some equal and opposite force. So that I can just see that is a fundamental principle we can't quite escape, except for in the abstract domain. And I think in the abstract domain of the mind, the reason that we don't perceive this is because we don't perceive boundaries, right? We create artificial categories in order to construct boundaries so that it makes it easier for us to think through conceptual spaces. But it's very easy for us to eliminate those or adjust them or change them. And so it's easy for us to create circumstances that couldn't exist in real physical space. Nevertheless, and this is also why I think there is some fundamental difference between mind and brain, right? I'm not going to go down that territory though. That's another ball to throw up in the air. We're all chugging like 15. So this question of can we develop? I think the answer is yes. Can we develop and then perfectly adapt? So this is maybe is the final point I want to bring in, because you mentioned integral theory, and one of the key concepts in there is the transcend and include notion. And that's where you're getting that spiral phenomenon, which is I'm going up and higher and I'm gathering together all that I have and I don't lose it. Now, this is a very naive, simplistic model with this like idea of development. Because when I take a look at human capacity or biology in general, we don't see these transcend and include dynamics. We see these adaptive capacities to alter and reconfigure that take a time. There's a time in which that process has to occur. And so pace is a big part of what it is to be adaptive to your environment. And that noticing of the fixedness, and here, oh, and this is the final point, capture. You can't avoid being captured. And I don't think that's possible. And I like the point I think Javier made, that the recognition of the limitation produces also the boundary by which you escape, right? So gravity is a boundary, right? It produces a condition upon which I can escape if I develop something like a plane or a rocket. And who taught the Wright brothers how to build their plane? Right? Who educated them on that? And it's a funny question, because clearly they learned from observing other flying things that it was possible for things to fly. But then they learned by trial and error. And so it was the feedback between the environment that taught them, right? By refining their conceptual spaces, by seeing where things failed. That's where the true knowledge seemed to come from. That's where it always seems to come from, is we learn from failure. So how does knowledge come from failure? Right? And is our educational model currently, is it teaching people through failure? Right? Or is it teaching them through indoctrination, which is not to fail, but to create the perfect response every time on a test? So those are my thoughts. Wonderful to see you all.
That I really, really like what you had to say there, Tyler. Especially the point regarding how theoretically, when we're in the thinking mode, the boundary seems to be absent. And I think how in tangible life there is that boundary. So for me, the issue here of capture comes with, to me, this is like the true starting point. It's recognizing that thought and physicality's boundaries are different, in the sense that one has a boundary for us finite beings, and the other has no boundary. So in that sense, we need to conform and shape our thoughts to the boundary that we finite beings are residing in. So in that sense, when we put a boundary on thinking, we can understand the element of capture in a more fruitful way. Fruitful how? Fruitful in the sense that you don't view it as a capture, you view it as a morphology. So it's, in that sense, it's not like it's a rational self-transcendence, but to use the word transcendent can be a little misleading, in the sense that there seems to not be a boundary, because you could always go to the next level, like in a video game, where eventually in a video game there's a final level. So there's a point where transcendence can't transcend anymore. So in that sense, I like to think of it as a morphology, in the sense that and this is very Heideggerian, in the sense that how Heidegger understands time, he doesn't understand it in terms of past, present, future in three distinct modes. He views it as almost like a funnel. One funnels the other, but almost in an ass backwards way, in the sense that the future is what makes the present have meaning in a crude way. That's a Heideggerian point, where the present isn't actually present until it understands where it has been, while understanding the futural element of that present. So in that sense, it's a collective of oneness, and not a division of three different parts. My point is that we don't look at capture in terms of a division, like time. If we can move capture in a Heideggerian sense to how Heidegger views temporality, in the sense that if you realize you're captured, you're ipso facto, you realize you're like you said with this quote, you're being thrown in a sense to a different story. Now, I like to think of things in terms of story, and regarding change, it's realizing new ontological stakes are within your worldview. So you already possess ontological stakes. Something's happened where you feel like those ontological states have captured you. You're within a normalcy. And within that normalcy, there's an opening that can occur where something can incite you to then be sprung forth into a new world with new possible ontological stakes to be discovered. What that ultimately means is that going from capture to uncapture to capture, aka change is only a qualifier of how the meaning in your worldview has adapted to a new world. So it's, you have a current worldview, it's on world A, something incites you, you realize world A isn't world A, it's now possibly world B. And world B has a new meaning, new stakes that need to be understood. And that's what I meant by earlier by a mere understanding. That understanding only occurs within a world view, and a worldview is only that, a worldview. So your worldview is susceptible to change, just like your perspective of the world you're in is also susceptible to change. It's like one of the same. So in my mind, the trick is changing the problem and not call it a problem, but in a corny way, it's the solution to a new exploration. And that fundamental change needs to occur in order to get out of that existential angst of capturing, of being on standing reserve. And to tie this into just like the concept of social media and all this information putting us on standing reserve, and technology putting us on standing reserve, that if we can look at this big pool of information and we can almost tell ourselves stories that we're seeing, we can realize that regardless of the amount of information that is being taken in, we can change our interpretation of that information. We can be the authors of our own phenomenological lens, so to speak. And that's not the only way. I take that back. It's, in my mind, like the first and easiest step in fighting back in the ontological design. It's, in essence, it's like you're designing yourself, but not designing like the world that you're in, where ontological design is more about designing the world that you're in. So just to clarify what I mean by that, when you're in a world, you're being designed in that world and you're designing it back. I'm emphasizing the designing back aspect internally, your internal feedback loop. You can tell yourself any story you want, regardless of whatever world you're in. And that possibility is what I think the individual needs to hold on to in this technocratic, controlling world.
I think one of the things that I'm hearing actually, and one of the things that I want to sort of respond to, is this question of adaptation at some level. Because if you think about adaptation itself signifies you as somebody who's adapting to certain external norms and rules. And that is where, say, Bernard Stiegler would sort of bring in a distinction, adaptation and adoption. That when you adopt an object and when you adapt to an object, they're two different. For instance, when a child has his own teddy bear, he doesn't simply adapt it; he adopts it in something. He makes it. Walcott has a very interesting, I think, paper from which Stiegler sort of brings it, and it goes back to psychoanalysis. And I think the question we are struggling with actually is a question that I think Freud struggled with in the first place, and this is where development becomes a very interesting kind of a problem. Because Freud saw that a subject can keep on adapting to his own symptoms without necessarily outgrowing them, without necessarily overcoming them. So in that sense, development is taking place, subject is, finding ways, and he'll always find some new way to do it. It's not like repetition is never simply repetition. Repetition always demands this structural, support from newness in that sense. And subject can keep on adapting to his own symptoms, for a long, long time. And Freud could see, in fact, even Hegel has this idea that some point contradiction comes on the surface and you overcome it and so on and so forth. But Freud could see that it doesn't work like that. Which is why Freud sort of entered into free association and so on and so forth. But that question becomes extremely important. And I think Freud's one form of the answer was, which I think Zizek sort of gives in one of his lectures, that to change something fundamentally is to repeat it exactly. Is to completely affirm repetition. I think that is what Javier was trying to tell us also, that you have to completely affirm the capture in some in that sense. That you have to change the background in which it is being interpreted. It is when you completely change, you don't change the picture. It's the background when the changes, the picture interpretation completely alters itself and so on. So that is, I think one part of that discussion we are trying to think through. The other is when you think through this question of capture now from this lens, where a subject can keep on repeating itself irrespective of, when he's developing in that sense, he's adapting to the environment. That is never a question. But yet no substantial shift is being seen. If you start thinking from this perspective, what you enter into is these two kinds of modes of being in some sense, which is calculation and creation. In some that at what point a subject can reduce his own future, which is, I think, Andrew's bringing this question of futurity is extremely important, and which is there in Deleuze also, that at what point future merely becomes circular for you, when each newness is only for you to repeat something, and you completely reduce to what you call calculations, where there is no remainder left. Capitalism is one form of that process. Capitalism wants you to reduce all change to simple calculations, where it wants to completely remove the remainder out. It wants the remainder to be, zero at all points of time. The interesting thing is that change happens through remainders. Change doesn't happen through simple calculations. Structural shifts, paradigmatic shifts actually always happen through remainders. What is left, which cannot be accounted for, then needs to be accounted through a completely different background in which, that equation needs to be thought through. So I think it is in that context we need to think the question of development, because development cannot be simply thought through this relationship between individual and the environment in that sense of simple adaptation. If simple adaptation is going on, it will keep on going on. It can go on for a very, very long time. In fact, change only becomes visible to us in very minuscule, small moments. And Freud's initial problem was in that sense that subject can go on showing no change for a long time and suddenly show large amounts of shifts in very small periods of time. And how do we think through that kind of a distinction in the context of development, I think becomes important. And I think I'll stop here. I'll not.
No, that was excellent. Then I'll pass it on to Emilio and Tyler. So there's a few things that I'll just comment on quickly. So there's a sense, like Tyler was saying, that if natural selection occurs, the whole reason it occurs is because there is some sense in which it is better to have X trait than Y, right? So what is the nature of this development? There is some kind of advancement, but is the word advancement best or better? What's so interesting about the conversation at this point is we're getting into these incredibly fine distinctions that when we think about the meta crisis, because I'm thinking about Daniel's slide, I'm thinking about like all the stuff where people are like, we're all going to die unless we change some sort of way of seeing the world. Then it seems like very small distinctions are a big deal because we're talking about foundational things. In the same way that if the foundation of a building is all fine inch, the final structure is, it collapses, right? There's like a really fine thing. And it's exactly right. The point was raised that view and worldview are always together. The point was made that materiality and ideas are always together. But what comes first? If I understand a lot of the emphasis on, say, spiral dynamics in game B, there's an idea of, well, you change people's ideas And then that's kind of where the emphasis is. Now, maybe, this is where I don't want to speak for an entire movement, because people have different views. But if there's a sense in which people's ideas are very profoundly changed by material, if you change material condition first, ideas change as well. Whereas you could change ideas and not necessarily change material condition. Now, Andrew brought up a very good point, where if you can tell yourself, say, a different story relative to your condition, you can escape capture and make it captivation. So another thing, like, we're getting into this point of very fine distinctions. Michelle and I will make differences between capture and captivation, where there is something that has captured you, but it captivates you, as opposed to be kind of oppressive, right? Because if you have literally, like, the problem with the notion of capture is if you don't have any givens, if you don't have any societal givens at all, it's chaos. And like Philip Reef and different people will say that. So you need to have something to hold you, but then if you're being held, you can be oppressed, right? So how do you how do you tell yourself a story relative to what captures you so that it is sublimated? I like that term Andrew used of morphism. That was really good, where it morphs into a source of captivation. Now, there's a second question though, because if I just use the spiral dynamics language of talk about turquoise and yellow, and I'm not sure about coil, that's when it becomes very speculative to me. So it does seem like there's some percentage of people of whom, say, have for some reason told themselves a different story to become, say, tier 2 or absolute knowers. Let me just say absolute knowers, because all of these terms I think are very similar. So some people have learned to tell themselves a certain story so that then they are captivated by their conditions and they're not captured by them, but they're not also, say, French Revolution is tearing down everything, and that seems to be a problem. All right, well, I think a lot of those people then turn around and say, well, we can solve the meta crisis if everyone just, evolve their consciousness to become tier 2, right? Whereas there may not be an appreciation of the particular material situations or conditions that those people went through to become what they have become, right? So it's not so easy necessarily, because then it becomes like, what are those conditions that lead to? Because I guess I wanted to say to Chan, and then I'll pass it on, exactly to what you're saying. It makes me think about Chad Haig's work on fossil fuels, where he says when you exist in a fossil fuel society, then you define progress in terms of kind of infinite growth, and he calls that a deep mean. Well, you could adapt to the deep mean of infinite growth all day long and still have the underlying structure of economic sort of devouring everything, and there's a lot of adaptation there, but you're not changing the underlying structure. So as a result, you still have the environmental crisis, right? So what you'd have to do is, if you don't change the underlying structure, all of the quote unquote development that occurs on top of that deep mean is not going to, say, work. So here's the issue, and then I'll pass it on. Okay. If people's thinking is fundamentally structured by deep means, like fossil fuels, then the answer to the meta crisis can't necessarily be changing people's thinking, because you have to change the source of the deep means first. But Daniel Schleiermacher and all of them have made very clear that changing the material condition is very difficult right now because of all the game theory dynamics, prisoner dynamic, international relations, all these different things. So we have a problem. You have a big problem then. And I'm not sure, and maybe some people can correct me on this, I'm not sure if people who are putting the solution in terms of a kind of development of consciousness, which I associate with spiral dynamics, which is kind of evolutionary. Now, I did hear the people at Practical Integral talk about new colors being a result of the failures of other colors, and that felt Hegelian. Because the other thing we have to balance on all this is talking about some sort of clearing and spreading that isn't scaling and planning, because Hegel tells us that if we scale and plan, we end up destroying the world, right? So there's this kind of weird balance that has to be struck between not trying to plan the future that can be destructive, but also not sitting back and just pretending like the meta crisis will solve itself. Maybe it does. I don't know. There is a kind of sense where the solution could emerge, but what does that look like? And that feels like adaptation, but will there be time for it? So these are all things that I'm thinking about, and then I will pass it on.
Thank you. This is such a cool conversation. So I've taken a lot of notes, and so like the ideas I want to go through is like of course, as Daniel said, like you have to change the material conditions to change the thoughts. It's like egg and chicken problem. So I'm thinking, so how And it's difficult because of the game theory dynamics, right? Because at some other point, like you had physical conditions that transform into some different conditions, but it now seems that we're like on a stun lock or something, like we are unmovable, right? Like they are like the forces are perfectly balanced for things to not change, right? So it's quite a difficult thing. But this is where okay, so you have physical conditions and they give rise, but for me, like there's something that's almost magical in the sense that happens because let's say I don't know how you guys think, but sometimes I think in images, and so I imagine a bubble, like imagine imagine a city and like a dome, like right. So you have that, so that like those are the material conditions. So like a person, like a random person, by whatever reason, like starts thinking different, even though like the material conditions are the same for everyone. Like that person like thinks something different or thinks like a new way, right? So that's like you mean that a little bubble inside the big bubble, right? So so that's the opportunity or the way I look at it, how material conditions can change from an idea, right? Because it's like you have to have the idea of changing the material conditions for the material conditions to happen in a way, right? If you human beings as agents of bringing that change in the world and not just going along for the ride, right? So I find that even in books, when you have this totalitarian regime and stuff, there's always like a person that experiences that same material conditions, but like gets a spark of a different idea, right? So you have this bubble and this little bubble, and then the question would be, how do you make this bubble grow so it swallows the other one and changes the material conditions? So I think that yes, like maybe the question is not how do we use thought to change thought, right? Like how do you, like we use thought to change the consciousness. It's how do we use thought to change the material conditions, right? And because let's say that because the problem would be if the thought didn't occur at all, right? Because the material conditions are so that the could never happened. Like there's nothing to do. But the moment that you have the thought of changing the material conditions, then like maybe it's difficult, like extremely difficult because of the game theory dynamics. But then it's possible, right? So that's the way of thinking, because I do think that thought can influence matter, because like human beings are really weird. They have terraformed the whole planet, and just because of abstraction and meaning and stuff, like there's like we do have a particular power to bring our intention into the world, right? So that's but this is where I think it gets really interesting. Not all people can do that, and I think of people like saying like, imagine if like we are spheres with gears in it and we are like spinning, right? Like that's the image I have, like a sphere of gears spinning. If if a person is this sphere of gears spinning, he can change and impact the world. But there are some people that whatever means of capture, like physical, their brain didn't like it's like something physical in their brain, or maybe they were like so severely psychologically indoctrinated into the way of being that they are like their gears are stuck in place, right? So it's almost if they are like they don't have that agency of power to bring their intention into the world. They just can receive what the environment gives them, right? So I find these two things that for whatever reason, some people in my mind are like this sphere with their gears stuck, and some of them have their gears spinning. How do you get that condition? That would be like, oh, it seems almost random, right? Because if I go tomorrow and like something falls in my head and I get in using this description, my gear stuck forever, there's not anything I can do, right? So and I am just like I'm doomed to like just be influenced by my environment and not being able to influence it back. But if for whatever reason this person the conditions were met for this person to rise and become this little bubble or this gear spinning, then you can influence the world in these ways, and then that's how thoughts can change the material conditions in the sense. So that would be like my distinction, because I think because well, if you play video games, some people to me like seem NPCs, and like a lot of love to them, but they seem like really capturing the world thinking, right? Like they have they don't seem to reflect on what they do or what they say. They are just like in the very way they are just acting as of the script they have in their head, and they have no ability whatsoever to question that script. So if you don't have that ability, you're the gear, the sphere that has the gear stuck, and there's nothing you can do. And it's weird because these people are like have their gear stuck there, and they are just like they have no agency. They are just influenced by their environment. They can develop, but in a captured way, which I think that's really interesting, because I have a professor that he's teaching me anthropology, and he, at my personal opinion, he's really captured in the woke mentality. I'm not saying woke mentality is good or bad, just let's say that he's captured by it, and it's jarring, because for me he is like yeah, he talks about like the patriarchy and stuff, and he like all these concepts that are, well, I relate with wokeness and stuff. But the thing that for me was wild is his complete lack of self introspection. Because, and the most concrete example I can give, I was accompanying a friend to have her, she was going to get her an essay checked by the professor. So, and the professor said that like, oh, sorry, like last time I think I explained you incorrectly what mansplaining was. So mansplaining is when a man, and my friend, yeah, I know. So he literally mansplained the concept of mansplaining to and he didn't even realize. He didn't even realize that was the case. He's so indoctrinated into his woke mentality that he didn't realize, right? So you can say that before that he said that before that he used to tell like his friends like, don't cry because you're a man, and now he has changed and he's like in touch with his masculinity and stuff. So he has developed, but in a completely captured way. He has no critical thinking and introspection of the thing. So you can also progress in a captured way, so that I find interesting. It's when you're this spinning sphere of wheels, you have this ability to become like it's very important, because you have like the optionality and capability of doing stuff. Because I was so happy. I remember one short part of a book that's called by Fable Heaven, that is about fantasy, and there it's a magical setting, right? It's a magical forest and fairies and stuff. It's just very magical. And one of the characters, there's this pond, right? This lake, and there are mermaids inside, and the mermaids can go out of the pond, but they don't want to. They have this inner desire to stay inside the pond. They could go out, but they have absolutely no desire. But one of the main protagonists, well, one protagonist, he falls in love with one mermaid, right? So he goes like every day, he goes in a canoe and he like talks with her and stuff. And one day he gets too close to the edge, and all the other mermaids drag him down, and the one that he was courting rescues him. Like she takes him out of the pond, she goes out with the pond with him, and then she's free of the enchantment, right? She doesn't want to go into the pond anymore, because it's kind of this magic thing. When you're in pond, there's no way you want to go, but when she's out, she was like, oh cool, and she traveled the world with this person and so when you're outside of the pond, like you can actually choose to go into the pond, right? Or you can choose to go anywhere else. But when you're inside the pond, when you're captured, it's almost impossible to live without I actually would say that it's impossible to live without an external factor that pulls you out, I would say. So I think that's really interesting. And yeah, so that's so those would be my main ideas, right? That if you are captured, you can only be like uncaptured when someone pulls you out of that thing, like in the metaphor of this lake in this story. You can be develop in a captured way, and you can exercise, if you can have thoughts change material conditions. I think that's possible if if first the material conditions were gratefully like gracious enough for you to be able to have that thought, and then you have that thought presumably, and you have this critical thinking thing, you can go and actually execute your will into the world. So that would be my three main ideas, I think.
No, excellent. And then we'll pass it to Tyler, Javier, and I'll just add the question I'm asking kind of to what you're saying is how do we assure that the solutions to the meta crisis are not captured by the meta crisis, actually, that they actually are solutions? And that seems to have a lot to do with some sort of externality, rather than be relationships, material condition. There's a sense in which a relationship, like you just described in your story, is a kind of material condition, right? You know, there's the body of the person you run into, and how that can pull someone out where but again, what is the nature of these material conditions, quote unquote, relational conditions, communal conditions, so on and so forth, that helps people escape just developing according to their neuroses or their symptoms or the very meta crisis, so that the solutions to the meta crisis actually just contribute to it. This seems to be a very big deal. And I'll pass it to Tyler and then Javier.
Children are funny creatures. They love to be captured. Really, like I play chase with them all the time, and when I grab them, I, you know, give them a big hug and laugh and tickle them, all typical stuff. And so the emotive conjugation you did, you and your wife, you know, that's it's a really important point, that you can shift from an inversion, right? You can have an inversion of affect, of meaning for capture and captivated. And that what that strictly defines is whether or not you want to remain as you are, right? Because if we're talking about change and we're talking about participating in it, we're talking about prescriptions, how things should be otherwise. And if we're talking about that, then we're talking about differences between the internal and the external. And there are some fundamental limitations to these kinds of things, like, for instance, the law of thermodynamics, entropy, right? There's a disorder which is continually accruing within me. I get hungry, for instance. I break down food, I excrete excess heat, all this stuff gets utilized, and I need to go find more food. I have a space that I need to go search within, right? It's a familiar space. I know there's food there somewhere, but I go and search it. This is intelligence, right? The ability to search a space and find it. And then if there's nothing there, what do? Right? If what I'm looking for is not in there, what do? Well, then I transcend. I look outside the space that I was looking for in there, and then I'm searching for this thing that I feel I need, and I'm just changing where I look, right? Inside of space versus outside of space, familiar versus unfamiliar. And the question of whether or not we can make an actual value assessment that comports to something which is existing in this abstract meta level is highly suspect to me. So the Freudian example, for instance, I can think of a million counterexamples where my prescription of how a person ought to be, so they ought to be not neurotic, for instance, right? So this woman is being neurotic, right? This woman has come to me, and I need to fix her neuroticism, right? The question of why I feel that is, I can explore that. Is it something she's reporting to me that she wishes to change, or is it something outside of her that's, you know, she's been brought to me so that I can change her on behalf of her husband or something like that? This is very common. You know, is she hysterical? I'll just make some presumptions, although I don't necessarily agree with this, but just as part of it, storytelling, we presume that the dinosaurs were wiped out by a meteor. Prior to the meteor arriving, we would say, a la Freud, it is bad to be a mammal. You get eaten by the giant dinosaurs, right? It's bad to be a small, like, we would make that value assessment from this meta abstract position. I'm looking at the space. Clearly, the dinosaurs rule the world, right? But then comes the meteor, and it actually turns out to be quite bad to be of a certain size and a metabolic rate that feeds on certain foods that are destroyed by it. And the things that survive are the things that I previously considered to be weak. So this emotive conjugation, this ability to cross a boundary condition and then see how what was previously conceived as to be a limitation is in fact, in this new environment, in this new circumstance, something which is quite profoundly necessary. And that's why I have trouble with the whole kind of pure notion of transcend and include. It's so radically dependent upon the environment. And so what I would say is we've already got answers to these questions that we're exploring. They've been developed and spoken of in two main components we call the East and the West, which is this dual movement of turning inwards and outwards, right? So I can turn inwards and alter intrinsic qualities within myself to readjust that sense of lack that I need to go and rebalance the energy, a la thermodynamics, or I can reshape the environment outside of me, internal and external, right? It's that boundary crossing question. Where do I go and do that? How do I go and do it? And so the piece that we need to have in order to consistently exist within this space of questions of how I participate with it is precisely how we are constructed already. We have both an internal representation of self and system within, and we have an external representation of arena. And so my ability to both explore within and understand and unlock intrinsic capacities, or epigenetically express things which had not previously been expressed, is one part. But the other part is understanding what is unfamiliar, what is unknown in the external. So I'm exploring both territories, the internal and the external. And as long as I have the capacities to do both of those things, I'm improving my chances at adaptation, right? Of being able to respond in that desire for homeostasis, right? Of meeting that sense of lack, whatever that happens to exist as. Teach how to search within, teach how to search without, and the rest is all the fun parts, right? Like that's where we argue with each other and build cool toys and find out that the toys hurt us in weird ways and argue about that. Okay. It's great to see you all. Have a lovely day. Oh, my heart. Thank you.
Always good to see you, Tyler. Thank you for coming today. Appreciate it very much.
Me too. Cheers.
Appreciate it. Javier?
Let's see if I can comment on like a lot of things that I heard today. I'll start with Emilio. Yeah, I really liked like you talking about your professor. You meet this same contradiction when because I'm very critical of like self-help, right? There's something very paradoxical about the idea of self-help, and yet you're reaching out for a self-help book. Like you just already catch yourself in like that contradiction, like, oh, you can help yourself. Well, if you could help yourself, you wouldn't be reaching out for a self-help book. But there is, and I think we've been hinting at this too, there is this idea that if we have the knowledge, we can change, right? But there's something like really deeply ironic about that, because once you have the knowledge, you understand your condition in a very clear fashion, and yet at the same time you keep repeating your condition. Like, I mean, it just happens. Like, I mean, I could read about weight loss all I want. I'm like, okay, cool, I know exactly what I need to do, but let me tell you, that's not gonna help me change one bit. So there is that, like, kind of big gap of understanding, when you talk to people about, if I just know something, then I can change my conditions. Actually, there is something fundamentally helpless that we don't like admitting openly. But but the thing is, just to kind of go back to the notion of development, is that when a book does change you, right? Not to say self-help books can't change you, they can, but the thing is, it's not the knowledge that is you're knowing it is going to change you. It's actually, or let me put it a different way. It's not you that changes you. You don't do developing does you. Okay, like that is basically essentially always what happens. Developing always does you. When you get inspired by a book and all of a sudden you start initiating actions, the real question is, why couldn't you do that before? And then when you start trying to find the cause, you might say, yeah, I changed myself because of this book, But at the same time, if that book didn't inspire you, the change would have never been initiated. So there's a way in which we trick ourselves into thinking that it is us that changes ourselves. And it's the same thing when we meet people. There's this idea that once someone says something, it affects me, right? There's deep interrelation going on always. And I think we've been getting at with this, environment and so on. But you guys have been asking a lot of good questions. But I want to get at like the conclusion of the notion of nothingness that Nishitani explicates in this idea that emptiness and nothingness is not a single thing. And he quotes this Zen koan, which I really love, where he says, to take up the spade with empty hand, to ride the buffalo while walking. So basically what he's saying is, he says, when the spade, the work, and the worker are one, there is no spade, there is no work, and there is no worker. All right. So when we talk about conditionality and this distinctions between mind, I mean, I don't want to get into the whole of mind and brain, whatever, but when we talk about like mind and physicality, right? There's a way in which we have to make it to where, like Nishitani said, there is no mind, there is no physicality. All of them is one. It's one. It's such a oneness that it's nothing. It's such a oneness that is emptiness. It's a way in which you could say, actually, my physicality is my mind, and my mind is my physicality. Right? There you would have it, right? But once you say that, then you say there is no mind and there is no physicality. And I'm still trying to grapple with this whole concept because I'm, learning this from Nishitani. But yeah, there is this, I'm a little critical of distinction, like making distinctions, but I think like the whole point of making distinctions is up to get to this point, really, in my opinion, to get to this kind of conclusion that Nishitani gets at. Yeah, and then Buber also makes a very good point, like you need the I-it relation in order to encounter the I-thou. It's always need that fail. And then to go to Daniel's question about, we talk about the meta crisis, I think Nishitani has like a kind of a good answer about what we need. We never need to solve the meta crisis, basically. Why? Because it always needs to be a crisis, so that way we can constantly reevaluate the meaning. Like it can't ever be solved. Just so it can always initiate this reinterpretation of meaning in our daily lives. As we're adapting or whatever, the only way we can sort of like overcome that is constantly reevaluating, reinterpreting it in such a truthful way. And Nishitani makes this like very the line very clear in the sense of like, we have to be very careful about this notion of progress, and we have to be very careful about this notion of like tradition. And where we basically are doing both, right? We're doing destruction and reconstruction at the same time. And he makes a very good example about like a kite on a string. If it has no tail, then it's not being blown. But then if it doesn't really have a string, it's not flying. But you also need a string to make it fly higher up in the air. So there is this balance between reconstruction and construction, and it seems like the notion of the meta crisis is like, in my opinion, it never needs to be answered, because every time we do answer it, well, we need to answer it again. So that way we keep going. But yeah,
it's kind of like when they talk about the meaning crisis. Meaning has always been an issue. In the same way that if you were to talk about a food crisis, one would not say that if you solve food, you don't need to eat anymore, right? It's always a present thing that you need to address. So it's important to have that framing. If we take Hegel's kind of onto epistemology seriously of AB versus AA, as I like to put it, then everything entails, everything that we need to do also entails a potential of what we don't need to do, like that will make things worse. So every quote unquote solution also entails a new way of making the problem worse. This is why it is so difficult. The point on like there seems to be a big difference, for example, when you come to someone and say, I want to overcome this neurosis, versus when someone else says you need to overcome that neurosis. Kind of to Tyler's point, that's like the Deleuze or Foucaultian correction to normality, where you have a notion of, oh, you're neurotic because you're not normal, when actually the thing that's being called quote unquote neurotic or problematic could actually be a good thing. And that's where Deleuze is sort of defending the schizoanalysis and so on and so forth for the mammals. But you see, what's so interesting though is why indeed are the mammals that at one point are a problem with dinosaurs in the next evolutionary superior because of the material condition. There are no longer dinosaurs. And now the material condition has changed. Therefore, it is better to be a mammal. But if theoretically the material condition had not changed, then it would theoretically always better to be a dinosaur. So there's this weird thing in which we cannot fully predict what the environment is going to be like. Therefore, there's a danger before making some sort of one assertive, it's better to be a dinosaur than a mammal. And this is where, to me, this is what I'm kind of orbiting around or have been thinking about, is what is the difference between, say, a material condition of like a field, an open space that allows for emergence and relationships and people encountering one another, and say going, oh, the material condition, quote unquote, that will solve the meta crisis is a city. Because then you build a city and it turns out, no, actually a city contributes to the problem and that's quite bad. There seems to be a radical difference between thinking about material conditions in a Hegelian way that makes space for emergence and the unknown, but then there is some element of creating a material condition for that. Like I think about the difference, what's the difference between the material condition of the internet and the material condition of, say, corporatism? Right? Like corporations or buildings or fossil fuels. This is where I think what we're talking about is we're getting into the actual like details of the particular material condition that is being questioned. Like when you say the material condition of fossil fuels creates a deep mean following Chad Haig, which makes us define progress in terms of kind of infinite consumption or whatever, right? That's what he talks about. It's a great book. What is the material condition of the internet do? Does it make you encounter, because you made a good point, and I'll pass it to Jichan, and like I said, final round, difference is something that happens to you. Okay, does the internet increase your likelihood of having difference happen to you? Or do you use it to escape encountering difference because you create a tribe, right? The material condition of the internet does not seem the same as, say, the material condition of fossil fuels. So what is a, dare I say, material condition that one can be intentional about that is making a clearing or opening for the unpredictable, which would for me be kind of more Hegelian and would actually fall in line also with the cone dynamics that I was saying at the beginning, versus we're going to solve the meta crisis with X material condition, and it turns out that that was unintentionally captured by the thinking of the quote unquote meta crisis that Daniel Schleiermacher and them talk about, and actually it's what the AI wanted you to do, and now the robots are in control, right? So this question is, to me, very fascinating because it gets into the details. And with that, I'll pass it on, and any final things that anyone has to say, please, Titan.
Thank you, Daniel, for the wonderful discussion. I'll just sort of immediately I think Zizek said it long back, and she's been saying it again and again, that a lot of times this urge to change something is part of the ideology that sustains that thing. And keeping that thing in the open. We need to start thinking that when Hegel started sort of developing his and we call Hegel an idealist, an idealist in some senses. But his problem with this mind-matter distinction was that matter itself is an idea. That is where he was trying to think through that problem. He was not an idealist simply in that sense that there is mind, there is matter, and then I'm choosing mind over matter. No, he wasn't simply playing that game, which is why Hegel could be succeeded by Marx in some sense, in that sense. That very idea of matter, it is not pre-given that my laptop and my phone and my bottle all is the same substance. It is itself a feat of some ideational element involved over there. And when Marx comes in, Marx actually links materialism not simply to matter in that sense, which is why for Marx, materialism was this function of exteriorization, that everything had to be exteriorized, and that is how Marx develops his political economy and so on and so forth, which we need to have a long discussion about. But this mind and matter distinction, simply I think post Hegel we can't take it simply in a granted manner. That is, I think, one thing that we need to start thinking more seriously about. The other is that you're right, the particularity of material conditions will always be, up for question. The challenge in Hegel is that each particularity would have its own contradiction at the same time. That contradiction cannot be simply given to you in advance. And as human beings, we will always make choices and we'll compare them. Comparison is not a problem. We will always compare them. We will always, through comparison, learn something new about them, and we'll make our choices based upon those things. But at the end of the day, no matter which choice we make, after the choice is made, we have to struggle with the contradiction within itself. And that struggle, in some senses, goes on. Given these conditions, I think Daniel's question can be asked with some seriousness, that how do we then respond to the meta crisis? What is our response within this framing possible? And I think that question then becomes extremely interesting. I'll not try and answer it, at least not towards the end and not in many ways. But I think the question becomes extremely interesting when we start thinking of it not in terms of simply, okay, let's get over the meta crisis, but in terms of how do we orient ourselves given the fact that we know there is something like that happening. In that sense, and then we can start thinking about that kind of question. Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. I'll also
that was beautifully put. And please, anyone will find out. That's exactly right. Like, what is the response to the meta? Given everything you said, should we ignore it? Should we not think about it? Is there something we should do today? Should we should we just create our communities and the people that come or not? Do you try to spread? That's exactly right. Very well put. Very well put.
It's funny how it seems that, at least from my perspective, there's just been a collective group of people on their own that come to the realization that they're in some meaning crisis. And I think it's not a question of whether ignoring or like paying attention or not. It's a matter of, if it calls to you, you just kind of answer in that sense. And it's kind of like you arrive at thinking. So in that sense, you arrive to the understanding that there's a meaning crisis. It's an arise of some sort. So I think it's not something that can be ignored, but it's something that the individual that notices it feels a need to solve. If it's not externally, it's also internally. And what I mean by that, like, if they can't solve it externally, it turns into a self-help of some sense internally. Now, I'm very anti-self-help as well, but I have an opinion that, like, for example, me talking right now, sure, it's for the sake of truth and knowledge, but it's also for myself. It's also for my own understanding and my own well-being in terms of how I should find meaning in today's world or just live life. The point is that it's a, like you were saying, it's a response, but it's a unique response, not like you're hungry, but it's more like an uncanniness. It's not something that's like so prevalent where it's like hunger, for example. It's like something almost in the background. It's like the backdrop of life is not being viewed properly, and the person notices that. And that backdrop being misunderstood is what is when that feeling of that meaning crisis is occurring. And to me, that's, for example, when you have that feeling, there's a certain change that happens in the person's brain, at least for me, and at least from like me talking to people that at least think that there is some sort of meaning crisis or some sort of issue on not knowing how to be. And that ties into what you were saying, Javier, to push back a little bit. To me, knowledge is change. So I very much think of it like a story, in the sense that you only obtain knowledge in a story, and once you do, it changes the journey of the story and how one understands their journey. So you got a protagonist, they're incited in some sense, they change. They're changing, but they don't know where that changing, where that becoming is going to be. And then eventually the climax happens and it becomes another change. And in that sense, the resolution takes shape by creating normalcy, creating a recognition for this change. And with that type of model, I like to think of the perennial problem of meaning and look at it in terms of there being this constant morphology of understanding how your world changes and therefore your meaning changes. And it's not to touch on the thinking versus material dichotomy. That's how, in a sense, it's a bothness. To call it one thing is missing the other element inherently. So because it's a sense of, there's a level of bothness, we need a response to this perennial meaning problem that entails this bothness and entails also this perennial issue that recognizes that I don't want to call it a circle, but that it's linear in the sense that it's continuously progressing in some shape or form, because the progression's domain takes hold in finite form. So there's an inherent level of progression, but the progression is only progressing in the sense of there being a theme or being some kind of meta drive that drives the progression. And in that sense, what we need to respond to is the relationship between the progression and the meta meaning behind the progression, being more aware of the meta meaning behind the progression. And that's something that we have not been afforded to, because we've been trying to understand progression itself. And we treat the progression as an end all be all, as in Heidegger puts it, be with a capital being. And because of, in my opinion, this misunderstanding of the focus of progression itself, you miss out on the relationship between the progression itself and the meta meaning that, from an a priori standpoint, throws the phenomena, takes from the noumena to the phenomena, takes from the noumenal realm to the phenomenal realm and throws it into that progressing sequence. So yeah, that's why I wrote in the group chat just a thematic response, a response that understands that relationship and takes that relationship with an intentional gripping and optimizes it in the sense that one doesn't respond in taking an absolute stance on anything. And that is confusing because it's inherently, when you take a stance, you have to pick a side. So it has something to do with the language. There's a language problem. And that is something that needs to be overcome. And the only way to overcome that, in my mind, is by implementing new language, by implementing a new dictionary, which is tangible, but it's also theoretical. So that's where it's that bothness is occurring in the encyclopedia change. And yeah.
I agree with most of Andrew's stuff. I mean, it was really like the idea of response, that's a lot of my obsession with Buber. My only concern really would be so Buber has a very good point on this notion of meeting. And I think to kind of answer Andrew's idea of creating a new language in encyclopedia is that, in my opinion, the new language is already here. Meaning when I meet another being, another thing, another person, there's, just to kind of borrow your language, there's a collision of stories happening. And it's that very collision of stories that in that very moment, in order for me to meet another person, to actually see a person as a person, we have to create the language together in that very moment. There can't be a pre-established new language. It has to be in that very meeting, the language itself manifests. for us to see each other as others. And the same thing with everything else. It doesn't have to be like human beings. It can be with anything else. And this is why I like Buber so much, is because it's in that very moment. And we're going to fail. We're going to fail a lot of times. But it's what Andrew was getting at, which was very important, which is this notion of responsibility. That when we talk about the meaning crisis, you don't settle for someone's universal answer to the meaning crisis, because that's a cop-out to your own meaning crisis. You have to respond, and then you take the risk of that failing response. You can only hope that it's a good response. And Buber calls for this constant turning for response. You know, you have to continually respond, knowing that this is your best response, right? And there's no guarantee that it's going to be a good response or a failed response. But you're responding. You're taking that responsibility. And this is, of course, the whole entire of like Nietzsche's critique, really. Like, you can't just fall under some universal good and evil. You have to really respond to your own good and evil. That's taking responsibility. So there is this way in which, you know, it almost seems like the way to get out of conditions is that Buber has this way of like, we need to form character in a way that you see the person as they are in terms of their becoming, not as they actually are, but in terms of their becoming, meaning that they have the ability to respond with responsibility to a situation. And that's like really that's like the best we can do. And I'm going to cut this off because I could go like on a rant about social ethics, which because I talked with Michelle about, where I was like, basically social ethics is embodied in the particulars. There's no social ethics that you can point to because everybody has a different notion of social ethics. So there's always going to be that collision of social ethics when you meet a person. But yeah.
I agree with you, but I also disagree with you in the sense that I agree that it happens in the moment, but there's a historicity element that the individual brings to it. And then with that, I also disagree slightly with like, I agree with what you're saying about ethics. Like, I totally agree with it. But at the same time, there's a relationship that you have, like, individually with your own historicity. There's this own ethic. So it's like, I have my own history. Let's say I was raised to be ill-mannered, to not have good manners. And let's say in my worldview, that is actually having good manners. And the second I portray my upbringing's manners, my historicity to the moment, it, like you're saying, it's either going to be met with like rejection or acceptance, and it's on me. It's like my risk. It's my response to the moment. That's my risk. But there's a relationship. There's an ethic that I would say that I'm missing. If I genuinely think when I meet you, Javier, instead of shaking your hand, I slap you across the face, and that's how I'm raised. Like, and I don't question that. By the time I get to the moment, there's an ethic that's going awry within myself. It's just, to be crude, it's like, Andrew, are you saying that every time you met someone, you slapped them across the face and no one's ever said anything to you? Or if they did, you just never noticed it? Like, that sounds a little like preposterous. So there is this ethic that exists outside of the moment. There's this ethics that you have toward your future that I didn't talk about. Like, if I'm a heavy smoker, I'm putting myself, my future lungs in bad shape. Oh no. So like, am I doing good to myself if I smoke? But let's say in the moment I need to smoke to feel a certain way. Like, there's a common thing where cigarette smokers, they got to smoke cigarettes in order to poop. It's like, if I don't smoke a cigarette, I'm not going to poop. Like, I have to poop, but also at the same time, I want my future self to have healthy lungs. So like, I'm not sure if the ethic is quantifiable to the moment. Now, Heidegger would say it's quantifiable to the moment with a capital M and not a lowercase m. And like what that just means to me is it matters when there's ontological stakes involved. And to have ontological stakes is to respond to the world in a way where you're addressing your past and future simultaneously with the moment. Yeah, I can elaborate on that, but I hope that sentence makes enough sense in itself.
I mean, it makes sense, but I'll just say like Buber and Heidegger definitely had beef. So, I mean, I can definitely understand. I can see the discrepancies because I'm more Buber, you're more Heidegger. Buber would say there is no such thing as future because every notion of future you have is predicated on the past. If there is a future, it has to be completely unknowable. And you know, and so, but I'll stop there because
I would agree
you know,
with that. I agree with that. Like I agree with Buber saying the future is unknowable. I like Buber's understanding of the past, and I like to think of it in conjunction with Heidegger's understanding of time, in the sense that it's predictable in the sense that I can say there's a future. Like for me to say that there isn't a future seems more delusional in this moment than me saying that, like, if I say I don't have a future, that's an odd control of my existence right now. Because I'm sure at the next net session or a future net session, the possibility of me talking to you is possible. Like for me to not think that would be unreasonable. And that to me is where I like to incorporate story. Like when you involve story, you immediately get a sense of an unknown future, but you get a sense of a future. And in that sense, you got to rely on your past in order for it to spring forth.
When you think about this problem of having history and no history, and we might think that being in the moment demands us to have no history. There's this slight kind of a problem there, in that sense that idea is that when you're in a moment, the history gets rewritten retrospectively. You actually don't have a history. You actually write a history always retrospectively. If something happens and your whole story of the past changes, isn't it? And it is in that shift that history is visible to us. History is never visible to us simply as something we are taking it into some, For instance, if I am going into some kind of a context and I already know how I'm going to act in it with complete surety, there's a contradiction there also. I can't create something with another individual. And while I totally agree with you, that doesn't mean I'll go and say I'll slap somebody and those are my manners. That argument doesn't work. But that argument doesn't work precisely for the same reason that you cannot go into a situation and say that I can only act in this manner. They're also doing the same thing. You're already having a predetermined set of idea. Else you have to go into a moment and find out with the other person involved over there what kind of manners emerge. No matter what history you have, you always will carry a history. You always have some kind of grammar in your head through which language has to emerge. But language can never be reduced back to the grammar itself. There will always be an excess in that situation. So if I have certain set of idea of manners in my head, I go into a situation and I say I will only follow those. You will always enter into a problem, isn't it? If there is no excess over there, if there is no creation in that moment in which you're calibrating with somebody else sitting next to you, where the calibration is not going on, you will always find that contradiction to re-emerge. And just sort of putting that in context.
No, this is very well put. So a few things. There seems to be a difference between the idea of having a future and a past that you have emerged, that comes unto you, that you're open to, as opposed to when you look for it. You have this story in the Bible of Lot's wife, where, it's all good and well until he looks over his shoulder and then his wife turns to salt, right? So there's something about when you look for the future or you plan the future, then there's actually a problem because you have to do it in concordance with your ideas of the present and the past. And now it's like, now you've kind of cut yourself off from the future. You've turned, as I understand Heidegger, the problem is, if we're mixing Heidegger and Hegel in a sense, the problem is once you do that, you then necessarily make the future a source of lowercase b being versus uppercase b being once you start looking at it. And that's what's kind of strange, because obviously I would assume that in 5 minutes I'll be able to go down to the kitchen and eat tuna with hot sauce. But at the same time, I don't actually know that the kids didn't take all the tuna and throw it in the garage, right? So there's a emergence, but there's also a kind of, I have to assume that it is possible for me to go to the kitchen and go through time for me to even have that unsuspected thing occur. And I think this feeds also to what Andrew was saying about this interesting thing of if you slap someone, there's something that, yeah, I hope the tuna's still there too, Javier. That would be good. I wanted to mention, Andrew, the prune juice companies may pay us not to air this because they're going to lose all their business to cigarettes for all the elderly people. So maybe we can make some money from the prune juice company. Anyway, but there's a way in which, like, if I slap someone, because being, you know how earlier it was said, development is something that has to happen to you more than you develop. Alive beings are the ones that can bring you the unsuspected. Alive human beings can bring you being, where, you know, actual capital, if we just use the capital language, you like the capital B being will require you to encounter something that happens to you as opposed to something that you just plan, right? Well, what can be a great source of the unexpected? Other people, right? But if you slap every single person you see, then you cut yourself off from the possibility of something happening to you, or a source of the possibility of happening to you, which in a way seems to be worse off than, say, not engaging in that ethics. So when we think about ethics in terms of leaving yourself open to the emergent, or capital B being, if we use that language, then there is a sense in which it is better to engage in not slapping people in the face than slapping people in the face, right? But this is what's interesting, because now we're talking about ethics, and this is all to kind of bring it together to what we're talking about. This is talking about ethics in terms of what creates a clearing for the emergent. And we've been talking this entire time about this balance between planning a solution to the meta crisis and making a clearing and spreading that clearing so that something can emerge that addresses the meta crisis. Oh, but the moment you start talking about solving the meta crisis, it's like looking at Lot's wife and it turns to salt, and now you're planning and now there's a problem, right? So there's this weird way in which there is a way that you approach the meta crisis that simultaneously doesn't look at it so that it doesn't then fall into planning and then it'd be like Lot's wife. This is freaking fascinating to me. And this is how I would close it. And I've really appreciated this conversation. We may just have to pick this up next week, because I think many times this conversation about the meta crisis, which again is the global warming, fascism, totalitarianism, AI, all of those wrapped into one, right? And our ability to see it. A lot of times they'll talk about it and they'll frame it, but then when it comes to the question of like, what do we do about it? Often it can seem like, I'm not sure, very honestly. But this is how I want to put it. Oh, I also want to add, Javier, when you're talking about this risk, that makes me think of Raymond with thymos, and they were talking about on the Stoa, like how society today doesn't address spiritedness and thymos, how there's something about the Boobian risk, or even the not slapping somebody, because then you're open to the emergence of what they do, which is a kind of risk that seems to address the thymos, the spiritedness that Raymond and Notes from a Pod. There's something about that goes together. But this is what I want to say. Andrew made this point about this idea of this strange call that occurs, right? The call that then you come, and then the meaning crisis is an issue. Then philosophy enters into, right? So this kind of call. And I think Andrew is completely correct that the meaning crisis kind of has to come after the call. Because if you never had the question of meaning arise to you, you wouldn't need it, right? You know, so there's something about the meaning crisis almost being after some sort of initial thing that calls you to meaning. And what's interesting is it would seem to be the case that increasingly more people today are feeling that call, or it's not being addressed. That's why we call the meaning crisis a crisis. Whereas in the past, because meaning is a constant need like food, the material condition seems to have addressed that somehow, and now it does not. So something seems to have changed, where then people are feeling the need for meaning and they don't know what to do. And it has something, and then the ability to even address the meaning crisis seems to come from the call to need to address it. So this is how I would frame it. As I understand Daniel Schleiermacher, a lot of the game, like the rationalist community, their solution to the meta crisis seems to be to have everyone experience the call. Figure out a way to create the conditions so that everyone experiences that call that will transform their cognitive faculties or the way they think or they carry themselves in the world, which will make them the kind of beings that transform their metacognition so that they no longer fall into the game theory dynamics that define global capitalism, energy, AI, so on and so forth. So this is basically what they're saying, it would seem to me. So we need to spread the amount of people that feel the call. Okay, how do you do that? Do you change the material conditions so many people feel that call? Or is it some sort of development of consciousness that leads people to having that call? Or do we just say, well, that's not possible because the complexity of what arises to people feeling that call is too complex and unknowable to systematically scale, right? Or to spread or different things. So this is the question. How can you spread the amount of people that experience that call in time to transform the cognition of the average person on planet Earth to a degree where the majority of people have that transformed cognition, and therefore local governments, states governments, and international relations cease falling into the game theory dynamics that are defining the meta crisis? That, to me, seems to be, if I'm understanding a lot of the Daniel Schleiermacher and different people, that's the strategy. Expanding the call or expanding the people that have that feeling and change their cognition. Do we think that will work? Do we think that is possible? And on that, I know I just opened a massive, but that's how I would frame it. And I think that would be and I will now, I've been thinking about that a lot because that seems to me, and I like the language of the call, it seems to have something to do with that. And with that, I fear I must head off to work in different things, but I've enjoyed this very much. We should talk about this because this to me is the question. Like, can you expand the amount of people that experience the call, or is it too mysterious? Because let me just add this last. In the past, they used to say the source of the call was what? God. And you can't control who God speaks to and who doesn't. Then Heidegger comes along and say, all right, well, we're going to separate God and being, and actually it's being. Okay, so it's like the exposure or the experience of being, the call of being, right? And it opens up. And so we can just put in Heideggerian language. Can you engineer the conditions of which will have average people hear the call of being, per se? All right? But the word engineer is so dangerous because we learned from Hegel that if you try to plan the future or you try to engineer something, you end up creating something worse than what you plan. And if you engineer, it's probably captured by the very problem you are trying to solve and thus engineering a solution to. So it's not going to fix it. It's going to be captured in the Black Mirror episode. It's going to be captured in Kafka's Circus and different things like that. So what does it mean to create a clearing or engineer a clearing for the emergence of the call of being, of which if the average person on planet Earth does not undergo, following Schleiermacher and these different people, you will not have a prevalent change in cognition that will result in the average person, in the average government, in the local governments, in the state and the international governments not falling into the game theory dynamics, of which is going to result in nuclear war, AI takeover, algorithm takeover, environmental destruction. So can it be done? And with that, I wish you all the best. Thank you for your time.